So welcome to our discussion of unconscious bias. My job is to introduce unconscious bias to you, and I do have to tell you that my biggest disclosure is not AstraZeneca. It's that I am not a sociologist. I am just a surgeon who got kind of really wrapped up in this because I thought it was really important, not only for how my patients view me, but how I view my patients and my colleagues. Unconscious bias, it sounds kind of harmless, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very intentional, but if you look a little deeper into these words, you realize it is important. Other words for unconscious include things like comatose, paralyzed, and senseless. And bias, that can be defined as being bigotry, intolerant, or unfairness. So the reality, unless you want to risk being seen as a comatose, senseless bigot, you might want to understand that these things exist in you and in those around you. I got interested in this when I was driving in my car, listening to NPR like all good Midwesterners do, and I heard this riddle. You know, a father and a son are in a car accident. The father dies at the scene. The son is badly injured and rushed to the hospital. In the operating room, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son. How could that be?" And there I am. My mind is doing somersaults looking at all of these ridiculous family situations that would make the surgeon a man before I realized the surgeon was his mother. I am a female surgeon. My best friends are female surgeons and mothers. How did this happen? How is it that in the back of my mind, surgeon equals man first? If that lives in my mind, like what other scary things live back there? And really, how do all my patients and my colleagues view me? One other scary thing about this riddle is that it has all these clues, these things that increase that link between surgeon and man, which means that other people, advertisers and such, they know that's back there and they can manipulate it and I don't even know it. So then I got kind of scared and mad and I had to learn more. This was the book I went to, Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases in Good People by Banaji and Greenwald, and it kind of very simply and in plain language that a surgeon can understand goes through hidden bias and unconscious bias and how it works. And it's all really based in what they call mind bugs. These simple, quick, fast things that happen in the back of your mind. Decisions and assumptions that are made without you knowing anything about it. And this is a really cool thing about our mind, but it's also a bad thing because these quick decisions that you don't know about are not always good decisions and they can be very biased. So this is another riddle, this one by Roger Shepard, that kind of goes through and shows us about the power of our unconscious mind and what lives in here. So here are two tabletops. Our mind is amazing. It can take this 2D images we see or 3D images in the world, create them into 2D pictures in our mind, and then put it back out there to something that we can work with so that we don't run into doors and tables as we go through. And as we look at those two tables, those two tabletops are clearly different sizes, right? They have to be. They are, because that's how we see them in the 3D world. But the reality is they're the exact same size. They're the exact same shape. But no knowledge of that by our intellect can change the fact that when we look at them, they look like different sizes. Our mind has done that automatically for us. So these assumptions, these associations that happen in our mind are essential for us surviving in the world, but they're not always right, and especially when we think about things that require a higher level of reasoning and understanding. So what does that mean about our social interactions? Well, humans are social animals first and foremost. Our brains are designed to pay special attention to those around us that are like us. But the reality is when we meet and work with people around us, we make a lot of assumptions right at the first meeting. Are people like her or him good people? Do they come from a good group, a bad group? What can we know about them? And we make assumptions, like I said, on our first group, and we use social context similar to the legs on those tables to put them into an understanding that we can work with. The problem is grouping people like that, essentially using stereotypes, really causes us to lose the value of the individual and sometimes to make snap and incorrect decisions. An example of this was the Madoff Scandal. So sad. But reality, He had many victims, and they were very diverse. But Jewish philanthropic groups were overrepresented in that by so much. Why? They identified with him. They saw him as one of their own. They trusted him, maybe for no other reason than that. And we all do those things. They didn't see him as an individual. And sociologists, economists, they tell us over and over again that people are treated based upon their social group very frequently. And we see that all the time. We heard about that at Starbucks in Philadelphia not too long ago. Just by someone's social group, they received a different treatment. The problem is when you do that, you lose the individual and you make snap and biased judgments. So how do we learn about the biases that live within all of our heads? Well, this was a big breakthrough that came in 1994, something called the Implicit Association Test. These tests have the ability to look deep into the back of your mind and to teach us about associations that exist back there that we can't really figure out just by asking blatant questions about race, sexism, all those kinds of things. And this test relies upon your previous experiences, how they are deep in your brain, and how you can't put those aside when you're asked to do very simple, rapid sorting tasks. So again, similar to sorting a deck of cards into hearts and diamonds and clubs and spades, that's a lot easier than to sort them into diamonds and clubs and spades and hearts. It's just what our mind does. So this was the first IAT test. This is called the Flower Insect IAT. And in part A, you're asked to check on the left for insects and pleasant words, and on the right, if you are seeing a flower or an unpleasant word. In part B, it's a little just reversed. So flowers and pleasant words on the left, and insects and unpleasant words on the right. And you go through and you score it up and you see how long it takes and how many errors. Well, the reality is, for all of us who are not entomologists in the room, we pretty much have a pretty quick association between flowers and good and bugs and bad, and that it's much harder for us to do the opposite. And therefore, when you were to take that test, almost all of us would be able to do that B bar much faster and with fewer errors, because that sorting is done so quickly in our heads. And the reality is how you score on that creates what they call a value or a variance. It's really your attitude and how much in your mind you associate those things. You can learn more about the IAT. It's open to everyone. The tests just go online. You put in like your name, not your name, forgive me, like your age, your sex, things like that. And you can take all of these IATs. There's a huge series of them and kind of learn about what goes on in your own head. And you can start to learn about things like race and gender by simply putting in names or faces of African Americans versus European Americans with similar words for good, bad, violence, peace, or other things. And the reality is that over 50% of people who take these tests get a different report back that goes against their stated beliefs. And that's actually not really affected by your gender, your race, or your age. So some of these variances live in our own heads, and some of them are actually very self-sabotaging. Similarly, you can look at gender and career IAT, where they put up male and female words and compare them with career and family words. And again, many women, some of the people who score the strongest of having a connection between male and career are working women. So it is important that we recognize these. So again, so that we know how to go around them, how to bypass them, how to recognize them in ourselves and in others. Dissociation is that occurrence in our head, that tension which can exist when mutually inconsistent ideas remain isolated from each other. And that's because our mind has these two sides, the reflective side, our conscious side, what we believe, what we state, how we vote, things like this. But there's also the automatic side, the less conscious, based on feelings and things we know implicitly. This is sometimes, I think, a much more reflection of where you came from than maybe where you want to be. So the question is, which side of your mind really wins? Do these associations, which probably exist in all of us, really affect behavior? And the reality is they do. Time and time again, study after study, one meta-analysis after the other shows us that the score on the IAT does correlate with discriminatory behavior. When I say discriminatory behavior, that's not violence, that's not aggressive language, but that's more subtle social things. How you evaluate candidates, how you treat your patients. And that's maybe even scarier. This is the subtle stuff we don't really think about. So, implicit bias, it's subconscious. It operates on a subconscious level. We don't think about it, it's just there. It is rapid and automatic, but it is not always correct. It is often contrary to our stated beliefs, but it's in all of us. And it's important that we recognize it. It's part of how we survive in a complex society, but it's a little bit of a bad byproduct of that. And we need to be able to recognize it and learn how to work around it as our society becomes more advanced and our field does also. Thank you.